What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 248. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. But there is another. This isn't Highlander. There can be two. It's Brian Wong.
Oh my God, Marshall. I just had flashbacks to my first episode. A deer in the headlights look has just come across my face. What is happening?
It's so funny because I remember, you were like, I'm prepared. Okay, we're good to go. And I think you had this feeling back then that like you were going to say some of the things you wanted to say and then you'd kind of be out of gas. Like that was what you had to offer the Magic community and you were going to walk away. And it was like, I had a little more faith in you than you did. And I was right.
Nah, that's not exactly what I thought. I just thought if I really hate doing this, I want to get out my most valuable message first. And
okay, fair. Yeah. A little bit more negative than the one that I said, but sure. Okay, we've got a pretty sweet show lined up this week. We're going to revisit what Brian was referencing just a minute ago, which is his first episode. He came on and talked to us about Quadrant Theory. Now, that was something that really stuck with me, and I know it really stuck in your mind as a listener as well, because we still get feedback about that show. And I also wrote the column, the limited information column this week. I wrote about Quadrant Theory. I've had people asking for that for a while. And so I wrote about it, and it's been getting good feedback as well. So we thought, let's revisit it. Let's go deep. Let's go back to it. We've got the now seasoned veteran Brian Wong, and he's going to talk to us about Quadrant Theory for our main topic. Before we get to that, though, a few things to cover. First, Card Kingdom, obviously. CardKingdom.com, great place to buy your cards. You can sell cards there. You can get all types of different things from supplies, for example, limited resources supplies. Now, quick update on that before we get back to Card Kingdom stuff. Sleeves are out. We have sold out of sleeves. Yes, I'm obviously grateful. Like, thanks everybody for buying them. I think that's awesome, and I got the vibe that people wanted them, and I'm happy to see that was actually the case. I have reordered sleeves. I did this about a month and a half or 2 months ago in anticipation of this happening. But it takes a while. They have to come in from overseas. It's a bit of a process. So we still got a little ways to go before sleeves come back. But once I get them, I will have an order down to Card Kingdom and they will be for sale once again. The good news is I still have deck boxes. I just dropped a shipment off there. Those ran out for a short while, but they're back up again. And I still have some play mats too. So those are for sale there as well. So quick update on that. But you can get other stuff too, of course, a sealed product. You can pre-order stuff. You can sell your cards to trade them in for draft sets. And, of course, like we say every week, they ship fast. They stand by their product, and that's why we love them. CardKingdom.com is where you want to go. Another thing that I wanted to update about. This is exciting, Brian.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, this is something that we haven't, that I've been kicking around for a really long time, and now we finally kind of have found a home for. So, on this podcast, my approach has always been that I'm very open to trying out new things, podcast related, either on the show or outside of the actual show itself. But I don't like to set up things that take a ton of upkeep, and I don't like to make promises that I can't keep or say I'm going to do this and then not do it. I think that's just really bad. I also don't like to have empty spaces, right? Like, oh, here's the LR blog, literally never update it, right? Like, I don't like that. I put up the crack-a-packs for every show on the blog just to keep things flowing, and then random other stories and stuff like that. And if I stopped updating the blog, I would just kill it. Like, I just would rather have it not there than not populated. And one thing that we've gotten requests for is a forum, a place for limited resources listeners and like-minded limited junkies to hang out, chat, talk about the show, talk about cards, talk about drafts, compare, pick quality, orders, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And I've always been a little bit reluctant to do it because I always had this kind of feeling in the back of my head like web forums were a little bit outdated somehow. Like, I remember using them, quite a while ago for photography and cars and stuff like that, motorcycle one, but like, they feel a little dated to me. And so I was trying to think of, well, what's better than this? And I talked to our friends from Loading Ready Run. I talked to Graham and I talked to James about it a lot because they're really in tune with this type of stuff, in my opinion. So talked to them and they said, why don't you try Reddit?
Old man Sutcliffe finally got on board with all the kids are doing.
Well, no, I've been on Reddit for a long time. Come on. I did an AMA like 3 or 4 years ago. Like, I'm not that old, but I also don't regularly use Reddit. I pop in every once in a while and I'll check out the Magic TCG section, but I'm not like a regular user. And so I wanted to make sure that it would be sort of in line with what we like to do on the show. And it turns out it is. So I started one. You can now go to our community page, and it is reddit.com/r/LRcast. And I've put that link, of course, in the on lrcast.com as well. It's right on the front page, so you can find your way there very easily and get in there. And I'm really excited. I've put it up, and this is the first time I'm mentioning it on the show, but we've already got a nice little flurry of action on there from me announcing it on Twitter. And I think it's going to be a really cool place for limited resources listeners to hang out.
And two important rules, the same ones that go for being in the clan, but you must love Magic and you must not be a jerk, at least in our company.
Yeah, I really want to make sure that I think this goes without saying for our listeners. I mean, our listeners are great, but I do want to reiterate that I do want to keep it, because Reddit is a big place and it's open to anybody, right? So it's not, it's not like our own little section, but this subreddit is our own little section. And I expect our listeners to act how they would in any other setting, which is, of course, treating people with respect. And, there's no stupid questions. There's nothing that's obvious. Just go ahead and, get some good discussions going. And speaking of good discussions, there's a few going on there already. So I can give you an idea of the kind of things that you're going to see on this subreddit. You're going to see there's a discussion right now, Brian, of interest to you.
Everyone's wrong. I'm gonna preface what you're gonna say by saying everyone's wrong.
So there's a discussion about what the greatest sign off ever is, and they're taking votes. And this is the thing that I love about our listeners, Brian. Is I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. Greatest sign off thread. Well, no, it's not good enough. There's a spreadsheet that's updated on the front with how many times a certain sign off has been mentioned in the thread. It is very scientific, and you're a little behind there, buddy. I'm not going to say who's winning. You guys have to go there to find it, but John Laux is kind of crushing you right now.
I just want to say that people have a very faulty memory. I think there's a couple of good sign-offs that people haven't brought up. And also, I mean, can we all admit it's Hagon and just, we're going for second place.
You can say that, but he's on the list and has not, pulled ahead where John and you are at even. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of your sign-offs personally. I think you do
There's
great
an
stuff.
Asterisk next to Hagon's sign-off, but still, he's in the record book.
He is.
As number one.
Other stuff they're talking about on the subreddit. This is a cool one. And this is really important. And this is kind of one of my main points for this. So one thing about Magic Online, we love it, right? I mean, version 4 has its issues and we're all working through that. But the concept and the idea of playing on Magic Online, I love. And I love playing on it. And it has the limited resources clan, which is only a few members away now from 4,000 people. We're the number one clan on there. But there's not a lot of support for clans right now. There's a clan chat that's really kind of buried now. And there's just not a whole lot going on. So one thing that we used to do on the limited resources clan a lot more, and I'm hoping becomes a bit of a resurgence here, is, Magic Online automatically saves all of your draft decks. And so if you've ever jumped into an 8-4 and, you mulligan to 5 game 1 and you got mana screwed the next game or whatever, and you're out and you're like, I drafted this green-black deck and I wanted to see if it was good. And I was going to try out Endless Obedience because I haven't played it yet. And I just didn't get any reps in with the deck at all. Now I got to pony up more money and jump into another queue. Well, what you can do is you can find that deck. It's saved on your computer. And then you can challenge somebody else from the clan or anybody you want into a freeform match where they load up one of their old draft decks and then you can play. And it's free and you can just battle as many times as you want. You can try out matchups. You can switch around the cards and say, I had a build that I did in a sealed like this, but I thought maybe this build was better. And you can actually just get reps in and practice. And I'm hoping that people on the subreddit will be able to sort of connect with each other in that way. And there's already a guide up. It says guide, and it's how to challenge others with draft decks. So you can go on there. The guy laid out everything really nice on Imager. It has pictures with how to do it in case you've never done anything like that, and you can battle people. So really cool. A couple of other topics going on. Somebody's talking about green, black, and M15. This is fantastic for us, Brian. Somebody made a list of the must listen to episodes of LR, which is great because I've been working on a blog post like that forever, but it's very hard for me to come up with a definitive list, and I'm going to use this as the basis. They put up a link to an interview I did with our friends Graham, James, and Jer from Loading Ready Run on their Tap Tap Concede podcast, where I talk about coverage and we do a crack a pack with Modern Masters and stuff. So all different types of good conversation going there, and I really hope that this thing takes off. But I've also got it set up so that if it doesn't, I'll just quietly shut the light switch off on it and let it die. So I think it's really cool, though. Yeah,
I'm excited about that, and I do think that's a better alternative than having some clunky old form.
Okay, good. I'm glad you think that. All right. Before we do Crack a Pack, let's do a quick listener write-in here. Rob writes in and says, I had some friends tell me they run Evolving Wilds in a straight-up 2-color deck, or even in a 1-color deck, no splash, just for value. While I understand there's some situations or conditions where this could be correct, I believe in normal decks this would be wrong. The wilds would only be good early and would be worse than a basic land in the mid to late game stages. They make the thin my deck argument. What are your thoughts? Brian, what do you think?
Well, I think that his friends are really basing that off of what they see people do in Constructed. And in like Legacy and maybe even Modern, there's like a mono red burn deck that puts fetch lands in the deck with only mountains just so they don't draw lands in the late game. And just the downside there is that they have to pay a life to do that. But the downside of the Evolving Wilds is your land comes into play tapped, which is, generally like more punishing than just 1 life. It's kind of a big deal. And especially if you get up to 5, 6, 7, 8 mana cards in your deck, it's like a huge deal if that land that you top deck is the Evolving Wilds.
Right.
So I mean, to me, I would not put Evolving Wilds automatically. I would not put it in a 1-color deck just for thinning. I think the coming into play tap is too big of a downside. In a 2-color deck, if I have cards that cost double colored mana in both colors, I'm automatically playing it. There it's just the fixing factor is definitely worth it. In a 2-color deck, if my mana was very good, where both colors were only like single colored cost, I could see not running an Evolving Wilds, but I still probably would. I mean, I'm just a fan of the fixing and just the consistency and just not losing the game where you only draw 1 color of mana. To me, that seems like the most common way the Evolving Wilds is going to hurt you versus help you, or vice versa. I don't think the thinning argument is too important. You're going to have how many Evolving Wilds? One, maybe 2 in your deck. I just don't think that you're changing the math that much, and I don't think that's a huge argument for or against it.
No, it's not. It's not a big factor. It's just not. Like you mentioned, the coming into play tapped is a big factor. That's a big deal. Your lands coming into play tapped can really screw you up, and it's certainly a much more important thing than the marginal advantage you get from thinning.
Yeah. So we also got a lot of questions similarly, like just, how do you play Evolving Wilds? Like, does it take a spell slot? Does it take a land slot? In general, you can just easily substitute an Evolving Wilds in your deck for any land. So if you had, 17 lands, 3 of them are Evolving Wilds, it's going to perform very similarly to a deck with merely, 17 basic lands, as far as, number of lands you draw in a game. I could see if you had a bunch of Evolving Wilds and you want to go cast an 8-drop, maybe that's an argument to play an 18th land there, because the Evolving Wilds do thin your deck, and over the course of a long enough game, you will draw less. You will draw fewer lands, I guess, because you've searched them out of your deck. So I could see in a situation like that, you could lean more towards playing the 18th land because, you're going to be drawing less. I don't usually consider my Evolving Wilds thinning factor too significantly one way or the other, though.
Right, but I happen to agree with you as well. Like, I think that I tend to lean towards playing it almost no matter what in a 2-color deck because, man, I've just lost too many games, and the downside isn't that big. Like, if you have it in your opening hand, it's almost never a downside. You play it on turn 1 and you get it out of the way, and you're usually not doing stuff on turn 1 that's that meaningful anyway. And then if it's in the middle part of the game, you can usually get away with it. The only time it really stings you is like where you're just like, I need my 6th land. If I draw a land, I can win this game. And then you draw that.
Yeah, I had,
and it can get you. That is a tangible downside. It does count.
It's the kind of thing that if you play enough Magic, you're going to lose a game of Magic in almost every conceivable way. But just like last week, I had the game where I'm on 7 and I have a Stormtide Leviathan in my hand. And of course, the land I draw the turn before I die is the Evolving Wilds. I can't play the Leviathan. But it's hard to get too mad. Like it's going to happen every now and then. But what are the odds of that happening? Like pretty low.
Yeah, and I mean, in all the scenarios that we just gave, that's only one of them. Like, because the story that you didn't tell was the game before when you played it on turn 1 and it made it so that you had no mana issues for the entire game, and maybe you won because of that. Where if that had been another island, maybe that would have cut you off from a color and you would have had to mulligan. It definitely pulls its weight on the other end of the spectrum too. So
yeah. In that deck, I was splashing a mountain for my Nightfire Giant, so it's not like I wasn't going to play the wilds. It's just kind of an unfortunate side effect that happens every now and then.
Yes, and I think that the key thing for that is that you just own that, right? You're like, look, I played it for the upside, but I accepted the downside when I put it in my deck, and here it is, the downside.
Yeah, so just a quick recap. Would I play it in a one-color deck? Basically never. I'd rather play Radiant Fountain or just another basic. Would I play it in a 2-color deck? Basically always. And once you get to 3 colors or more, it's like Evolving Wilds become very, very good.
Right. Crack a pack?
Let's do it.
All right, this one is from Kevin. I met him at GP Boston. Thank you, Kevin. Mm-hmm. All right, let me get this. Oh, yes. That's a good one. I think this one came from Belgium based on the smell. Lava Axe.
Lava Axe. We'll be talking about that one later.
Yeah, we can just whip right through that, though. Tireless Missionary is another one that...
Tireless Missionaries, quick story. I had a draft go, kind of pear-shaped. And I was like,
man, I like pears.
I am like really up against it for playables. Like I just unless I go into like an even 3-color split, like I'm going to be just totally up against it. And I knew that, I wasn't making my last few picks. And I end up having this Tireless Missionaries, and it's like staring at me, and I'm like, I'm going to play Land 19 instead. So I played Land 19 instead of crappy Tireless Missionaries.
Wow, really? I would have played Missionaries. Missionaries is a card.
My deck had like a really wonky mana curve where I had almost nothing to do before turn 4. And I was like, well, I have to get to 4 on 4, otherwise I'm dead.
Okay, I'm on board then.
And then I was like, how often is the Missionaries actually going to help? So what I ended up doing was on the draw, I would side out Land 19 for Tireless Missionaries. And I made the finals of this draft. So, that's what they say, like, don't give up, no matter how bad your deck is, you play it out.
Good for you. Glacial Crasher.
I still have not seen that card in play, I don't think.
Oh, I played it multiple times.
It's fine, right?
Fine.
Whatever.
Yeah, curve topper. But I want to be in red blue. Like I'm not waiting for my opponent to play a mountain.
Would you prefer Crasher or Miner's Bane in a blue red deck?
Crasher.
Okay.
And I like Miner's Bane. I think it's okay. It's just that there's too many commons that can trade with it. 3, like any hill giant trades with it, and there's a bunch of them.
You might be right, but
invasive species trades with it. It hits hard though. I like the card. I just think Crasher's a little better.
You might be right.
Plummet. Plume.
Yeah, still not main deckable.
No.
But you can side it in against, a couple different decks.
Yeah, it feels good when you do. Green Doomblade, sort of. Carrion Crow?
Carrion Crow?
What are your thoughts on Carrion Crow?
It's like the quintessential C, where it's like, it doesn't
mediocre ever.
Pretty much, And frequently when I'm sideboarding and I need to bring in something that's high impact, like maybe like another Fester Gloom, or I think it's going to be a long game. I'm going to want something a little more expensive, and like Carrion Crow is almost always the card I side out, just because it just seems so average and not important.
What about Bronze Sable?
I like Bronze Sable.
Bronze Sable, not a cat, it's a sable.
Bronze Sable does a lot of work, and we're going to talk about that one later in the show too.
Okay, we'll leave that one for now, but I agree. I think Bronze Sable overperforms. And in fact, it's really interesting. Like, our next pick is Oresco Swiftclaw, a card that has gone steadily down the ranks for me. It's still fine. Like, I don't cut it usually, but this is not a card I'm excited to pick, where I thought it kind of would be. I thought, well, that's a perfectly aggressive 2-drop. Like, we've seen this type of card do some good work, but Bronze Sable's just better in a lot of spots. It's weird.
Yeah, I also think that in some formats, a 3-1 is better, and I think in Theros, it being a 3-1 body is pretty useful. In M15, I would actually prefer a 2/2. I think like a Rune Claw Bear might be better than the 3/1. It's just such a dangerous world for those 1 toughness attackers, and just like getting Forge Deviled or Squidded or whatever is just miserable.
Yeah, I feel like invincible when I play a Borderland Marauder because it has 2 toughness. Like I'm just like unstoppable.
It's a big deal.
Negate.
I think Negate is a little bit underrated in the main deck. And I'm pretty excited to side it in against, certain decks. And Triplicate Spirits, you hit that.
Yeah, especially, I think that it's also Raise the Alarm, which are, like, we're used to being able to side in Negate to deal with people's answers, right? Like their removal spells or, their random enchantment or equipment or something like that. But you can actually answer threats with Negate in this format. And that comes up more often than normal. Still not all the time or anything, but like aren't the 2 best white commons Triplicate Spirits and Raise the Alarm?
Yeah, probably.
They counters both of them, and they're those 2 threats. And then if you are too late for that, you can counter the Sanctify Charge, and oh boy, does that feel good.
Yeah, and importantly, you can predict which turn your opponent is going to cast their Triplicate Spirits on. If they can cast it, they're going to cast it, right? So
they never wait; they jam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People aren't usually playing around Negate in that type of situation, so you can prepare for their Triplicate Spirits turn if they have it. So I don't know. I think it's a card that doesn't have a lot of answers to it. Negate's a decent one.
Agree. Scrapyard Mongrel.
I think this card been going down in people's pick orders because it really feels like it goes late now.
It goes very late now. I still pick it. I mean, it's hard to make it a real thing, but like 3/3 for 4, sure.
I think it just has to do with the difficulty in getting enough artifacts.
The ones that are good get picked up by everybody.
Yeah, it really feels like even if I'm trying pretty hard to get as many as I can get my hands on, I can get 2 or 3 at most. Like just ones that I actually want to play.
Right.
So it's a little rough. I mean, I still like the card. And it also might just be a glut at 4 drops too in red.
Sure.
Feels like that.
Pillar of Light.
Pillar of Light. I'm happy main decking 1, but obviously you have to board it out sometimes.
Man, I just feel weird with it. I always feel like I want to bring it in out of the board. Like, I want them to show me something. Because, like, the first time they play a Triplicate Spirits and I'm looking at my Pillar of Light, I just want to rip it in half. Stupid Pillar of Light. Wall of Mulch.
Wall of Mulch. This is a card that does not get a lot of respect either.
No, it doesn't.
And it might just be that it doesn't deal with the aggro decks that well. It's decent against red, but we were just talking about the white deck, and blocking 1 token is really not that impressive, especially when you don't have any power to at least kill it.
Right. Paragon of Gathering Mists. That's the blue one.
That's the blue one.
Yeah.
All the Paragons have gone down in my estimation a fair bit. None of them are like automatic plays except the white one typically, but I mean, at least your blue creatures have evasion and it can really increase your clock in that type of game, but I'm not particularly excited about the blue Paragon. How about you?
I actually, it's gone up for me. It's funny.
Really?
I like it quite a bit these days, but the problem is the ordering, right? Like, I never take it first and then try to move in. I always take like the Welkin turns and then try to pick one of these up in the mid to late part of the pack. Yeah. So even though I value it highly, it's in such a narrow subset of decks, it makes it not a high pick still. So yeah,
I guess that makes sense. The blue one, of the Paragons is one that I like a little bit more than others because at least blue is actually a pretty aggressive color. At least you can draft it like that.
Yeah.
So with all your cheap flyers like that, it can be pretty good. The green one, giving trample has been pretty relevant for me. And I like that aspect of it, whether it's like Ancient Silverback or Phyto Titan or just some, big dumb creature that needs trample. The black one I don't really like that much, and the red one seems a little bit unimpressive, especially in a color with better force.
Yeah, that's not that great. Altac Bloodseeker.
This guy's sweet.
Yeah, it's pretty decent, yeah.
It just sets up scary blocks. It has like semi-evasion because your opponent's just really terrified of it. You just can't afford to get blown out by the Bloodseeker. And then when you actually do the crazy like Cone of Flame or whatever you're gonna do, it just like ends the game instantly.
Oh man, I've never done that. Like 3 for 1 to wipe their board and hit them for 8 or whatever.
I've seen it. It's
that
pretty
sounds
cool.
Sweet. I want to do that now.
Yeah, that card's really good. I guess Kenji really unfortunately tweeted that he sacrificed a Generator Servant to play Juggernaut, and his opponent had Altac Bloodseeker in play. which became a 4/1 first strike, and then Juggernaut had to attack. So
that's awesome.
that is very embarrassing for Kenji.
I do love Kenji.
I mean, that's an easy mistake to make, but yeah, Bloodseeker has all sorts of application, and even just like little like Forged Devil or something, just pick off something. Now you can attack. You have to chump or take 4. It's really good. It's one of the best 2-drops in this set. It's very powerful.
Man, this pack is a bit of a stinker. Our rare is Sliver Hive.
I've seen a lot of reports of people sliver hiving.
Yeah, you only see the reports when it works, though.
That's probably true. I mean, it's not like a huge cost to put a Sliver Hive in your deck. If you had a Constricting Sliver, I would be like, okay, yeah, go ahead and play the Sliver Hive.
Yeah, that's true.
That upside is incredible. And with the green Sliver, that's a pretty playable one. Get enough Death Touchers, I could see that being relevant. I wouldn't consider it really a reason to put the black Sliver in my deck, even though that combo seems decent. But I'm punishing my mana, and I'm adding the crappy black Sliver. I don't really want to do that.
Right. No, I agree. I think especially the white one, the Constricting Sliver makes this thing an unbeatable engine. And for the cost of, being colorless mana instead of, air quotes, real mana, colored mana or whatever, that's worth it.
Yeah.
Huge upside, marginal downside.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. What do you like out of this pack? There's a Swiftclaw, Bronze Sable, Mongrel, a Pillar of Light, the Bloodseeker, Paragon, Wall, Carrion Crow, Plummet, God, Missionaries. I know what I'm taking.
I think I might take the Bloodseeker. And
yeah, me too.
Like, it's not a great first pick, and I'm not a card I would typically first pick, I don't think. But it is a very powerful 2-drop, and goes with any red deck basically, because the reason you're playing red is because it has incredible burn in this set. So, we're going to make it work if we end up red anyways. But when you have a first pick this week, you can't be too afraid to abandon the color if you see something better in a different color.
Yeah, I agree. And I would take it too. I think it's the best card in the pack.
Yeah, what's your second pick? It starts to get real sketchy.
Yeah, it does. Mongrel, let's see here, Bronze Sable, Swiftclaw, Pillar. I think at this point in my M15 career, I would actually just take the Paragon and try to force blue, like try to pick up as many flyers as I could.
Yeah, that's not crazy. I mean, I'm still a little partial to the Mongrel, and I try to make it work. Maybe I just haven't caught on quick enough.
JYD.
It's not great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the reason why I'd go with the Paragon there is because I think blue's underdrafted, and I've been having some decent success with blue, but also because I think it's the pick with the most upside. Like if you first pick a Paragon and then just like string together a couple of Welcome turns or whatever, like you have a very powerful little package going there with not a lot of downside. And if you don't get there, that's fine. Like I can ditch the Paragon, no problem, if blue's completely dry or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's good. Okay. So thanks again, Kevin, for the pack. Main topic time, Bri.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting because this is, I think, my first actual flashback to a topic we've already done. I'm starting to feel old.
Yeah, but they're fun. This is actually really fun because we get to sort of like if there's any little thing because I'm sure you felt this. When you do a podcast, like you got a topic and there's all this stuff you want to cover and like you cover it. And then sometimes you're like ready to go to sleep that night and you're like, oh, I forgot to say this. I was going to use this example and it was going to be so sweet. And like, you can't get it back. It's out there forever without it. And this is our chance to get it right. So
I think about the first 10 shows I did. It really, really bothered me every single time. And then I just learned to accept it.
Yes.
I'm going to forget 15% of what we should have said every time.
Yes, and that is a smart way to do it, but it still bugs me whenever I do. All right, so Quadrant Theory. Let's dive into Quadrant Theory here, Brian, and let's get a good deep discussion going on one of my favorite topics. I wrote about this in the column, so you can find it on dailymtg.com under the limited information column for this week. But I framed it in the same way I'm going to frame it here, which is it's the thing that you've taught me that has stuck out the most. I've obviously learned a lot about limited from you and having you on the show and stuff, but I think this is the one that sort of it's the most concise tool that you've given me, where it's just like, this is a thing, and I'm like, accept thing, and I'm like happy now that I know more about Magic. So why don't we dive into Quadrant Theory? What's it for? What is it? How does it work? Why don't you give us a big picture before we get into specifics?
Okay, so what is it for? And I think it's a framework to help you think about cards, and especially new cards, because like brand new cards, maybe cards that have an effect you haven't seen before, or they're in like a different package. It will make them less overwhelming. So you have a starting point. You can break it down into like these little chunks where you can actually kind of get a grip on what this card can do in different scenarios. So it's basically thinking of Magic, especially limited Magic, because limited Magic is played on the battlefield. It's really about jockeying for position, getting more or bigger creatures than your opponent. Like that's usually how you win a game of limited. So it's about thinking about how various cards impact the board. And it's the four most common states of the game, which is basically the development stage, which is when players are playing out their opening hand. It's about parity situations where both players have basically exhausted their resources from their hand, and now really the top of the deck is going to decide who's going to win the game because neither player has a clear advantage. Or like a state where one player is far ahead of the other, winning or losing. So it's either you have more creatures, bigger creatures, or maybe evasive creatures that are, like unless something significant happens to change it, you kind of know who's going to win. So it's like either you're winning or you're losing.
Right. And I want to put an umbrella over this, right? So it's a card evaluation tool. This is a tool you're going to be able to use to help you decipher cards that you've never seen. And it's a really good tool for that, to do what Brian said, which is to get you sort of a baseline. And then it focuses on what's most important for limited. And you mentioned it, Brian, but I want to really hammer this point home. It's about board presence, board state. It's about what's going on the battlefield. When you play constructed, you can play decks that play no creatures and don't care what your opponent's doing, right? They just goldfish. They're just like, well, here I am. I'm comboing off and you can't interact with me. Or I didn't combo off and you killed me. But I'm not worrying about anything that's going on the board at all outside of the things that affect how I'm trying to win this game. In Limited, that almost never happens. Basically, every game of Limited you're ever going to play is going to be heavily dependent on creatures and how they interact with each other, and whether you're ahead on board or behind on the board, meaning you have profitable attacks. You can attack better than your opponent can, or when your opponent can't at all. Or you have more creatures than your opponent, or you have bigger creatures than your opponent. And of course, when you start breaking things down into these categories, the creatures are what's really important, but also the removal. Because if you can mitigate what your opponent's doing, then the board gets better for you. It's a way to improve board state is by killing their stuff, because it's zero sum. I mean, the less stuff they have, the more you do in most scenarios. So that's, I want to just sort of, put a little frame around that of saying this is a card evaluation tool that is going to teach you how to look at cards that you've never seen and sort of frame them under the lens of how do they affect the board and how do they affect board state, because that's the most important thing for Limited.
Yeah, and it's by breaking it down into these four chunks, and in a typical match of Magic or whatever, you're going to see all four of these states, and some of them can be more likely than others depending on various things like the speed of the format or the matchup or whatever. But typically these are all somewhat equally likely. It's relatively close. So if you think about is the card good in this scenario, the more of these boxes you can fill, kind of the more versatile and powerful the card is.
Right. And I think that the thing to keep in mind here as well is that the quadrants were chosen because they represent the vast majority of game states that you'll see in Limited. Right. They do not represent every game state that you'll see in Limited, though. There's a few exceptions that you'll find some weird situations where you're not in one of these, and that's fine. Look, when you make sort of an overarching tool like this, you can't go into every detail. You have to look at what's the most important, and these four things are the most important.
Right. I think if you're going to come prepared, you want to come prepared for the most likely scenarios. If you come prepared for a very oddball one, well, most of the time you're not going to find yourself in that situation, and your cards you're targeting for that scenario aren't going to be very good.
Right.
So should we go a little deeper into explaining how each of the four work? Or
yeah, actually I think we should. Why don't you give me you don't have to use necessarily real cards, but I want to know let's give examples of each of these. So let's start with development.
Sure.
So you said players are playing out their opening hands, right? So they're playing lands from their hands, they're playing creatures, they're developing their boards, and they're sort of establishing themselves as like, remember we did the show on Who's the Beatdown? You're starting to figure out who's the beatdown in this particular game, right? Like, well, I'm ahead and I'm staying ahead, and so now that's what I'm going to try to do. And the other person's like, well, I got off to a slow start, so now I'm trying to stabilize and trying to get to that point. So talk to us a little bit about what development looks like, on an average thing and how far it goes as well.
Sure. So it means for a card to be good in the development stage, I want it to be a card that is typically very efficient. I want to get a lot from my mana, and you kind of assume that you're going to cast that card on time, right? So a 1-drop will be cast on turn 1, a 2-drop will be cast on turn 2, a 3-on-3, etc. Maybe up to 5 mana is where I would kind of draw the line there. But ideally, it's not just how rawly powerful the card is, but it's how good on the turn that you can cast it, and it's basically how much stuff can you get into play, or how much can you set yourself up for future plays. So like cards that make mana are usually development plays, but also just, efficient creatures, right? If you just get, a 3/3 for 3 mana, that's a pretty good play on turn 3. It's going to be bigger than, anything else in play by that stage of the game.
Yeah. And another card that jumps to mind is Grizzly Bear, right?
Yep.
Just a good old 2/2 for 2 is a really nice card in the development stages because it affects the board. It attacks, it blocks, and it only costs 2 mana. So, it's easy to cast. So, those are the type of things that I think of. Along with the ones that you mentioned there too, Brian, for development. What about for parity? So parity means a tie, right? Like both players have similar things going on.
Right.
So what are the sort of hallmarks that we're looking for? How do I know when I'm at parity?
Yeah, so usually just to describe the game state a little bit further, but it's neither player has a clear advantage in the game, and typically both players have exhausted the resources from their hand. So at that point, they say that you're playing off at the top of the deck. So you kind of, expect that you're going to have, enough mana out, maybe 5, 6, maybe even 7 lands out. You have as much mana as you need to cast your spells. And what matters in parity is just how rawly powerful the card is, right? You're no longer concerned about, I need 2 drops or whatever. Anything I draw, I can cast. So there's a lot of ways you can gain advantage here, but this is typically where, things with evasion can shine because they can make profitable attacks on a board that has lots of creatures out. Like repeatable effects, like something like a Rummaging Goblin, where it's like you can discard your lands to draw more spells. Just ways that you can gain advantage going forward and hopefully push the game towards a winning game state from a stalled game state.
Right. And, other cards to consider are cards that give other things evasion as well. That this is the state where they're good. Now it's interesting because one of the things that we can look at for things like this are also bad cards, and we can see why they're bad, right? So an example might be a card like Invisibility, right? On a stalled out board, this is where Invisibility is good, right? Now all of a sudden I can start hitting you with whatever my biggest creature is, and I can kill you with it. So there's the marks that it gets. As we're going to see as we go further, though, if you start looking at Invisibility in the other quadrants, it's not that good. And even in the parity one, it's not amazing. It's just good. And so, all of those add up to making what ends up being a pretty bad card. And we'll talk about how to frame that. But, there's good cards in those spots, and then there's bad ones too. A good example, I think, is Grizzly Bears again. Like you play it when you're at parity and you're not really doing much. Like generally speaking, if the board's fairly stalled out, a 2/2 isn't going to swing that. And that's not really what you were looking for. Another card that comes to mind when I think about parity is like a Lava Axe, right? If my opponent's at 10 and I'm at 10, like a Lava Axe just isn't doing a ton. Now, it might find me a win. Like let's say we're both at 15. Let's say we're both at 20. We just have built out our boards and haven't been able to attack each other, right? That's not going to break that parity. And that's what you want. You want a soul, right? Soul of Theros. Boom. Like what's the most powerful thing I can do here? That's what you want. Or you want cards. And that usually comes in the form of repeatable effects like what you mentioned with the Rummaging Goblin or a loot type effect, or just outright card draw. Because I'll tell you what right now, Brian, if I'm at parity and I draw Jace's Ingenuity, off the top, I am jumping for joy. That's got to be better than most anything I could draw outside of like my true bombs.
Right. Yeah. So the key difference between parity and development is in development, efficiency is very important. It's very important not so much what you get, but how much mana you had to pay for it. Right. But in parity, you don't really care so much about the mana cost, right? It's just about how much power you get. So the fact that you're spending 5 mana to get 3 cards into your hand, that didn't develop your board at all, but that's going to allow you to actually get, let's say you drew 2 creatures and a land or something like that. The combined power and toughness or whatever that you're going to be putting into play is so much better than you would get on any one card normally.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. Now, The next board state the next quadrant here is winning. And winning's an interesting one because it's actually a little bit deceptive. Brian, why don't you explain it?
So I think winning is, the situation where you're ahead. And the thing that was one of my main level ups as a player was when I realized I would get to these certain games where I would curve out, I'd play a 2-drop, I'd play a 3-drop, I'd play a 4-drop, and I'd be like, this game is going great. I'm crushing my opponent. Maybe they missed a land drop. Maybe they stalled out a bit, or they just couldn't keep up. And it's hard to curve out like that.
Yeah, you 2-for-1 them early in the game or something, and they haven't recovered.
Yeah. The game's like going really, really well, but then at some point I realized, wow, I've just only drawn lands, and now I'm out of gas. I just don't have any more spells, and it's like, what else do I need to help me close out this game when my opponent's down to 5 life or whatever it is, and I'm still ahead? And the answer is typically anything, like basically any spell, almost any spell, any creature, any combat trick, any removal, any equipment or whatever is usually going to be enough to get the job done. Which is why I learned to like kind of like devalue cards that were specifically good in the winning state, because it feels like almost every card that would be in my deck is already very good there.
Yeah, and I think that's important. Like, it took me a while to grasp that too. Because I look at these win more cards. That's what we call those. The cards that really are only good when you're already winning anyway. And these are cards I would have put in this camp, and they belong in it, but I would have put them in there like with glee, this card's so sweet because once I get my 2 dragons out, right? It's like, hold on, time out, right? We need a 20 here. Like that statement is absurd. Once you get 2 dragons out, you're winning that game. You don't need anything else. And so, your Crucible of Fire or whatever is not, the thing that won you the game. It's that you worked yourself to a board state where you could get 2 dragons out. And, I think if you were to time out in the situation that you said, Brian, so you play a 2-drop, you play a 3-drop, you play a 4-drop, which is already fantastic, right? Just that's pretty much living the limited dream right there. And you're attacking, and now your opponent's playing mediocre spells, but at a good pace, and you've only drawn lands. Think about what you want to draw there. And you'll realize the list is very big. Like if you were just to grab your library and just fan out every card that you wanted, like almost all of your spells will fit that description. Like even a bear, even a 2/2 just like allows you to keep attacking or, be a little more flexible or whatever. A combat trick is great. A removal spell is great. A 5-mana creature is great. Like everything there, is really fantastic for your board state. So I think that the key is recognizing that something is good when you're winning matters, but you don't want to put too much weight on it because almost anything should be good when you're winning.
Yeah, and that's what we should mention. There are cards that are specifically good when you're winning, and the idea there is when you're in a winning board state is you want to end the game. You don't want to give your opponent more turns because maybe they can draw something to help reverse the game on you, right? So you want to draw something that's going to close them out, and that's why a card like Lava Axe, it would be considered a card that's good when you're winning because it allows you to be like put the final stamp on the game. I got you down to 5, now you're dead. But maybe a little more versatile but still function in that scenario is a card like Into the Void, which is like now I get your 2 blockers out. Now my curve out creatures can easily kill you from that kind of board state. I guess the main thing that I would be hesitant to put in my deck, cards that are good when you're winning, is cards that reward you for doing lots of things that were already really good. It's like, oh, if you've dealt 10 damage to your opponent this turn, now you can do, thing X or whatever. It's like, wow, like, do I really need that though? Like, chances are I was going to win anyways. And I think like Dragon's Maze like famously had like Bread for the Hunt. It's like if you attack with 2 creatures that have +1/+1 counters on them or whatever, it's like, wow, my deck sounds like it's really humming. Like, why do I need this enchantment?
I think Might Makes Right is a great example of that. Like if you have the biggest creature on the battlefield, it's like, well, you've kind of already accomplished something with that.
Yeah, they're usually pretty good. The games you need to be worried about are the games where you don't have that, right?
Right.
So that's the issue with cards that are specifically good when you're winning. But there are, like we said, most cards do fill some type of role when you're winning, and to varying degrees, right? And that's the thing is like all of these quadrants, you kind of get like a score from like 1 to 10, right? Like or like even like a 0 to 10. Some cards just don't do anything to help you close out a game, right? Like a Wall of Frost, if you're ahead, is actually a pretty bad top deck because that's not going to attack at all. But almost anything is going to help at least a little bit.
Right.
So we'll switch it over to losing.
Yeah, let's talk about losing now. Because like when I think of winning, I think of like basically I have an attack that I can make every turn, and my opponent can't do anything about it. Right. Mm-hmm. Like I've got a 3/3 flyer and a 2/1 flyer, and my opponent doesn't have anything with reach, and I have enough stuff on the ground so that they can't really attack me in a reasonable way, and I'm hitting you for 5. I'm winning that game, right? Like right now I'm winning. With losing, well, the easy way to do it is just to be the opposite, right? I can't block your 2 guys, and I'm going to die to those.
Yeah, so it could be you just don't have any blockers out. It could be they have something evasive. It could be they just have like a singular bomb like Soul of Theros or whatever. There's actually a lot of ways you can be in a pretty behind in the game, but they can take different shapes. So it's important to realize that cards that are good here are variable depending on what different types of ways you might be losing. But in general, it's because your opponent has more stuff than you. Like that's the most typical way that you're losing a game of Magic is they just have more stuff than you, more creatures than you. So it's
more or better.
More or better or both.
Yeah.
And it's like how can you get the game back to even? You're just desperately fighting to get the game back to parity. So it's anything that's going to be good here is like this is like a little bit more difficult here, but just like kind of the most basic one is just a creature that's good at blocking because that will allow you to chip away at their attack force. You play like a 5/5 when they have a bunch of 3/3s that are attacking you, even if they have 3 or 4 of them, at least you get to kill one, save some life total, and hopefully you can stay alive. But cards that are especially good are cards that make multiple blockers, cards that make a lot of tokens. Like the best card in M15 when you're behind is Hornet Queen.
Right.
Because now you have 5 blockers, and those things can straight up trade with anything that's attacking you. Like that's a great way to flip the game on your opponent. Just any type of Wrath effect, anything that can deal with multiple creatures, like a Cone of Flame, obviously is great. Maybe they have 3 creatures to your none, and you might top deck Cone of Flame. You can kill all of them. If it just sounds like we're naming bombs, there's a reason those cards are bombs. Is because they're super good at reversing board states in a hurry. Like that's why these cards are bombs.
Yeah, I think if I were to rank the quadrants by how important they are to me, losing is easily number 1, and then development, and then parity, and then winning.
Right.
I think that's how I rank them.
I think, and we'll talk about how different archetypes might use this differently later on. But typically, if I find a card that's like excellent when I'm losing, like that's usually a very high pick for me. Because the other thing you have to keep in mind is the value of a card is really related to will it allow you to win a game that you would otherwise lose? Because otherwise, if that's not the case, what's the point of the card, right? If you'd be like, well, if I didn't cast this, I would have won the game anyways, was the card really pulling its own weight? And, a card that can actually steal you a game that was going very badly is a very important type of card. So that's why I put a lot of emphasis on cards that are good when you're losing. It's hard to find them. I mean, obviously, any creature that's just sturdy is pretty decent. But it could also just be cards that could give you, like, defensive tempo, right? Where it's like, it's going to come down, gain you some life and block, or it's going to like lock down some attackers and block, like Frostlinks.
Yeah, like that, or a Rotfeaster Maggot is a great example for a really solid blocker that also gains you some life.
Exactly. Just a card that's going to be like, all right, how am I going to buy the time to play out the rest of my hand or draw into other answers or just give myself a chance here? I need to get a little bit of time. But very importantly is I need to establish my own board state or remove yours, because if I'm just changing life totals, the game is still out of my control. So it's really about how can I get the board state back under control. But if you need a little time, a little life doesn't hurt.
Which also, by the way, goes to the whole the argument that you and I have, not with each other but with the world occasionally, about life gain spells that only gain you life.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, those type of cards, you'd be like, oh, well, it'll buy me another turn to maybe draw something good. The issue with that is you also gave your opponent another turn to draw another card that's going to put even more pressure on you. And, they get to put that card in play and keep it, and your life gain spell's now in the graveyard. So you actually are in a worse situation than you were before.
Right, which is interesting because I think when you put it on the quadrant theory, it's like, well, is it good during development? Absolutely not. Remember, board state's what matters in limited. Mm-hmm. Parity, no, because it doesn't break parity. Mm-hmm. Winning, no, because it doesn't help you win. Remember, we mentioned that almost any spell off the top is you're going to be pretty happy about when you're winning.
Yep.
But we also, Brian, mentioned very specifically that you're really looking to slam the door on your opponent. Every draw step that you can deny your opponent is a potential draw step that could have killed you or got them back into the game. And, a pure life gain spell does not help you close that door. And when you're losing, it's actually a fallacy to think that it helps you not lose because of what Brian just said, which is that it doesn't help you get back from the board state that you're in. And that's what most matters. So where is it good? It's not.
Right.
It's we can use the quadrant theory to tell us, well, it's not good in any of the stages that I really care about. Super hint. It means the card's not very good, right? But now you know why, right? It's not just somebody at the shop or us or whatever telling you, well, you shouldn't play life gain. It's not that good. It's because it doesn't affect the board, which I could end that sentence right there and and be pretty close to correct. But if you want to go one step further, you can look at all of these different styles of board state that you're going to face match in and match out and see that it doesn't affect them in a positive way. And that's why we don't play them.
Right. That's not to say I don't like cards that gain me life. I like cards that gain me life as long as they're also impacting the board.
Yeah,
so
we call that incidental life gain on the show, and those cards are quite good. Life gain matters in a big way. It's just when you have to spend a card to do it, it's not as good.
Exactly. So maybe we'll talk about the mythical fifth quadrant. I don't know if that's the right word
I wanted to. So I think that there's a lot of different board states in Magic. And the reason why we've chosen these four are because they're the ones that we care about and they're ones that are most common. But a question for you, Brian, would be well, what about racing? We see racing. Why isn't it a fifth quadrant?
Right. So racing, I would kind of define as a type of board state where neither player really has a chance to block effectively, but either there's something going on. So it could be the aura that gives you protection from all colors, right? And it's okay, that thing's just hitting me every turn. I can't stop it. All I can do is crack back, and it's usually evasion versus evasion, or I'm attacking you on some axis that is different. So I'm attacking you with Caustic Tar, you're attacking me with creatures. But basically, it's some type of scenario where my board state doesn't really interact with yours. It's just who can kill the other person faster. So cards that are specifically good in racing, I'd say if I knew the next game I was going to play was going to be a race, how am I going to fix my deck to improve that? First of all, I would probably go for cards that are good in development. I'd be okay,
yes.
if I can come out the gates a little bit faster than you, that's going to give me a big leg up on winning the game. Also, just any card that's good either in a winning state or a losing state will usually help because you kind of figure you're kind of in both, right? It's
yeah,
right. It's
it just changes very rapidly.
Yeah, it's I need a Flush to Dust to draw that flying creature that you're hitting me with, or I need a Lava Axe to help swing my race or whatever, or life gain, on my Rotfeast or Maggot or whatever. Cards that are good when you're losing or cards that are good when you're winning can kind of be useful in a race. What tends to not be good is cards that are specifically good in parity. So Rummaging Goblin, right? It's it doesn't attack that well, doesn't block that well, and it takes a long time for anything to get any advantage out of it. That's actually pretty horrendous in a race. So the type of card that is maybe good in a race that's not good anywhere else that's where you get the pure life gain spell, the Congregate or the Meditation Puzzle or whatever. Because it's okay, I can't interact with you. You have the aura on your thing that gives it protection from all colors. I actually can't deal with that. If I can just gain 8 life in that situation, maybe that's good for me. Or maybe the person who has the aura wants to gain 8 life there because it's I know you can't stop me. If I can just buy an extra turn or two, I can kill you. The reason that I don't really like cards that are only good in races, like those pure life gains or fogs or whatever, is just because if you don't end up in that state of game, and it's really hard to predict that you will, the card is just doesn't do anything.
Right.
Like if you draw your meditation puzzle in any other type of game, like it's really bad. So I usually don't try to like, hit the exact bullseye on the dartboard. I kind of figure if I have to aim that precisely, like I start to question. It's like, is it really going to happen? So I what I do is I tend to shift my focus towards development or parity, or development or winning or losing, and be like, okay, those types of things are going to be good instead. And if I end up in a normal type of game, I still know that they're going to pull some weight typically.
Okay, good. Now I want to move on to how this is actually implemented. I think we've done, a couple of examples here and a little bit of it, but why don't you talk to us about what you're looking for, when you get your result from the quadrant theory?
Sure. So I guess this plays into like my school of drafting, which is kind of how I've been playing for many years now. But I just look for cards that are good in as many of the quadrants as possible, or at least average. Like if I can get like a card that's like a 5 in all 4 quadrants, 5 out of 10, then I'd be like, okay, like I'm pretty happy to draw it no matter what state of the game I'm in. And if I have enough cards in my deck that are like that, it just means the top of my deck is going to be good for me more often than not. And if the top of my deck is good for me more often than not, it means I get better draws than my opponent. And if I get better draws than my opponent, I usually win.
Right.
So it's just being like, every card in my deck is good in a different situation. But if I have a higher chance to draw a card that's good in this scenario, integrated across all of my cards or divided across all my cards, my draw steps will just be better on average than my opponent.
Yeah,
so
you've also got an interesting scenario there too, where like you're just preparing yourself for facing. Like it's always stinks if your deck is skewed in one direction so hard that like if you face deck A, you just can't ever beat it.
Right.
Where you give yourself a chance to play against every deck.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So you might be. We talk about this in Who's the Beatdown. But if your deck is kind of all focused towards one type of quadrant, and your opponent comes out and is attacking you and putting you in one that you don't want to be, if your deck is too focused, you might not have any recourse. So it's like that's if your opponent is very aggressive, that's kind of like the weakness of a card like Welcome Turn. Welcome Turn is not a very good card if you're losing typically. So you have to be worried about that scenario where you want to be aggressive, your opponent is even more aggressive than you are. All of a sudden, your cards like Welcome Turn become very bad. Whereas if you have cards that are like kind of more all around, you can kind of adapt to whatever scenario your opponent is putting you in.
Yeah, I mean, and also if you just skew your whole deck towards like let's say the development end of things, where things are cheap and efficient, but not necessarily powerful. Right, 1/1s for 1 or 2/2s for 2 or whatever, and your opponent plays a couple of like coral barriers.
Yep.
You've kind of skewed yourself where your deck wasn't well rounded enough to be able to fight on different axes. It's just this one axis, and if you're good at stopping that, then I can't do anything. Right.
So that's kind of the thing where if you build your deck with all 1-drops, 2-drop, 3-drop creatures, or whatever, you're going to have a very high chance of curving out and getting into that game state where you're winning, and maybe you can push forward and win the game. But let's say you mana stumble or you mulligan or your opponent just plays some good defenders early on. I don't want to be in a situation where I just have no chance to win, which is why I like to have, some cards in my deck that are good in a parity situation where we've got to the board stall, and now I want to have cards in my deck that I can draw that will help me win that game. Or my opponent gets a better draw than me and I'm losing. I'm on the defense. I want to have cards in my deck that I can draw, and the more the better, that will pull me back into the game and maybe help me win. So it's just about making my decks more consistent by kind of like diversifying and making my cards as well-rounded as possible.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's also kind of trying to understand that some cards just are so good in one quadrant that it's worth giving up power in the other 3, or they're good in 2, but and you give up power on the other 2. So you kind of have to understand. So like, let's say that you have a card that's only good when you're winning. Well, that card needs to be exceptional when I'm winning. It can't just be like it works. It needs to be like it's going to win me the game. Right? It's not just like, oh, it's turned on and it has some function. It needs to actually,
definitively just smash. Yeah,
exactly. Or if I have a card that's only good in parity, as in like it's only good if I draw it, in a kind of a late game scenario, whatever. It needs to be very good there because I'm worried about what if I draw it in my opening hand, or what if I draw it when my opponent's beating me down, or what if I draw it when I just need to deal the last final few points of damage to my opponent. I don't want it to be. I'm giving up value if it doesn't do anything in those other scenarios. I need it to be very good in one. So it's like I need a super high score in one, or more like a diversification. And usually I aim for a diversification, but the thing about limited Magic and the thing about drafting is, you don't get to build your deck with exactly how you want it every time. You have to take advantage of it. And if you get a card that's great in a certain type of game, it might just be better than that Runeclad Bear. It might be better than that invasive species or whatever. And that's where you can, build the overall power level of your deck by taking kind of like role players, as I might like to call it, where it's like it's very good at the specific skill, but not good at others.
Okay, good.
So the other thing that I've just learned is, and I mentioned this earlier, but I've learned to put more emphasis on cards that are good when I'm losing and less emphasis on cards that are good when I'm winning, because I just find it's very easy to fill that checkbox if you're going through and fill, just scoring it. Is it good here, good there, etc. The winning quadrant is the easiest to fill. The losing quadrant is the hardest to fill. So that's why I put more emphasis on that one.
Yeah, and I think that's just something that you learn over time, that it's just rarer, right, to see cards that are really good when you're losing. And when you really look at the cards that are good when you're winning, the list is quite long. Like we said before, it can be often any spell in your deck.
Right. So I guess while we're on the topic of cards that are balanced, cards that like kind of perform in all four quadrants, like let's go through some examples.
Yeah, from M15.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think just the one that stood out to me the most was Kurd Chieftain, because in your opening hand, Kurd Chieftain is a 4/4 for 4, which is just going to be bigger than anything else in play. It's a very efficient way to play out your hand, right?
Yeah, attacks and blocks well. Yeah,
right.
Just super good.
Yeah, in a parity state, Kurd Chieftain will allow attacks with smaller creatures. You can spend mana and then trade with their bigger creatures. It may allow attacks that they do not have any profitable blocks. It's just going to allow you to start attacking when you otherwise couldn't. I mean, if you ever get up to maybe even 10 lands or whatever, it's just insane. Right, so a Kurd Chieftain is going to take a stalled board and put you in a state where you can attack again.
Right.
If you're winning, the Kurd Chieftain is going to close out the game almost immediately because it's a big attacker on its own, giving something +2/+2 and trample. That's going to close out the game very easily. And if you're losing, you get a 4/4 creature for only 4 mana, and that's going to help get you back into the game. Right? It's like because you need big blockers, and you may be able to even play the Chieftain with mana available because it's so undercosted. So you might be able to keep up a combat trick that otherwise you couldn't be able to do, or something like that. It may be big enough to survive a lightning strike or some other removal that would kill whatever wimpy other blocker you would have instead. It's just going to perform, pretty solidly on defense as well. So the Kurd Chieftain is just like the example of a card. It's so good in every scenario. That's why it's one of the best cards in the set.
Okay.
Kind of obviously, everyone I think knows that by now Kurd Chieftain is very good, but I'll just go through some other maybe kind of more mediocre ones. Like Geist of the Moors, the 3 mana 3/1 flyer, I think is going to be pretty good in all states because it's an efficient creature in your opening hand because it has evasion. It's pretty good in a parity or winning game state because it can force through the final damage. And if you're losing, it at least has enough power with 3 power that it can hopefully take down something that's on your back, right? And hopefully either it's blocking their flyer or blocking their Scrapyard Mongrel or something that will help get you back in the game. Raise the Alarm. This is kind of an interesting one. You might not necessarily think in all formats it might not be a 4-quadrant player, but I think in this one it is. So in your opening hand, Raise the Alarm is one of the best 2-drops in the format because in a format with Convoke, it helps you cast your other spells. So it's not just 2 power and 2 toughness. It's also
2 elves.
Yeah, it's like de facto Mystic Elves. It's actually really great in your opening hand.
Especially in the color that it's in and in the color that you typically see it paired with. It really does kind of double up on that.
Yeah. In a game where you're winning, you already have good attacks. It's really annoying to plink away at tokens that are attacking you because it just it just takes away more blockers. Rather than blocking your big creature with their big creature, it's like, do I really want to block the token instead and take all this extra damage? Maybe they can kill them tokens, but they have to absorb a lot more damage to do so. So the tokens are a pretty good way to augment your attack force. So it's good when you're winning. When you're losing, it can either like block multiple things, gang up and block something bigger. It's pretty helpful, and being an instant is nice. And at parity, you might not always think that this is a great draw, but given the existence of the charge and White Paragon and Sunblade Elf and other, these token decks have so many ways to pump their tokens, and that's how way that people are building their decks. Just getting additional tokens on turn 10 is not even necessarily that bad. So like it's going to be better than your average 2-drop late in the game. So I think that it has some function in a parity state where your other 2-drops might not.
Right.
Just real quick, cards like Frostlinks, Rotfeaster, Maggot, they shine when you're on defense, but they also like just have reasonable enough bodies. They may be able to open up some attacks. I kind of think of them as cards that perform in all states, and especially being creatures. Creatures are always good when you're winning. So like almost any creature will fill that. So those cards are pretty effective there. Maybe the Frostlinks in a parity state is maybe a little bit of a stretch. But if you have some flyers and they have a reach creature that's holding you back, that may actually allow you some profitable attacks, at least in the meantime. And then just like efficient removal like Stab Wound or Lightning Strike. Those are cards that you can use on curve, on turn 2, on turn 3 to kill their creature, to keep you from falling behind. You can basically it's you're not developing your own board, but you're preventing their development. They're perfectly reasonable there. When you're winning, gets blockers out of the way. They're great. When you're losing, because they're so cheap and they kill creatures, they can get you back in the game. And in a parity state, like a card like Stab Wound is ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
You put it on their thing, and all of a sudden you have a threat that's very hard to deal with. Or, just Lightning Strike is that can help open up attacks that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I'm going to go through like one surprising one, Bronze Sable. And this is a card that is not necessarily a player.
What is that doing on this list?
So in your opening hand, it's pretty obvious, right? It's your 2-drop, it's your bear. When you're winning, it's fine. It's 2 more power that's contributing to the game. In parity, there's a couple ways this can go. One is it can help like insulate you from intimidate creatures, which is important. But also because it's an artifact, it will enable your Scrapyard Mongrels or your Aeronaut Tinkerers. A Bronze Sable can actually be a pretty good draw late in the game because of all the cards that care about artifacts in the set. And on defense, it's not great, but at least it has enough power. Hopefully they can trade with something that's attacking you. And if the thing that's attacking you has Intimidate, all of a sudden you have actually a pretty important blocker there, a card that would be a better draw than most cards in your deck. So I actually think just because of how the format is, in Theros block, Bronze Sable would be basically a development only play. You only want to play it on turn 2. Or in a game where you're just throttling your opponent, right? It's a pretty bad draw in every other scenario. It's at best a speed bump on defense in Theros block, a chump blocker. But on defense in M15, it's going to block a lot of things profitably, or trade with things. But because of Intimidate, and there's 3 packs of Accursed Spirits and 3 packs of Krenko's Enforcers, it's actually a pretty relevant blocker too. So that's where I think the Bronze Sable in this format is pretty good in any state of game. Does that sound crazy?
It's a little crazy. I think everything you said is true, right? Like, I think that it's uniquely positioned to block those 2 Intimidators, which gives it a lot more defensive stripes than it would normally have, considering it's just a 1 toughness, 2 powered creature. So yeah, I'm definitely willing to bump it up a bunch. I'm not, like you were saying, 1 out of 10. In development, it's an 8 or whatever. It's like exactly what you want to do.
Right.
In parity, it's probably like
a 3.
A 3 or 4. Yeah. And it would normally be a 1 or a 0 or whatever the lowest is. So that is impressive. Like, you don't normally get that kind of a thing out of from a card that lowly. And I think that is definitely worth noting.
Yeah. So now I want to go through. So we talked about cards that are good in every scenario, or at least relevant in every scenario. There are also cards that are just only good in one scenario.
Okay,
right?
let's
They're
focus
only
on
good
these.
in one quadrant.
Let's drill down. I want to spend some time in a specific quadrant.
So we'll start with development.
I'd like to spend time there.
So I think the quintessential card that's only good in development, you only want to draw it in your opening hand. If you like, there's certain cards. If it's not my opening hand, it's like it's horrible. Mystic Elf, I think is the most obvious example, because a turn 1 Mystic Elf is fantastic. Any other turn Mystic Elf is usually a bitter disappointment.
Well, yeah. So it gets worse immediately, and it keeps getting worse the longer it goes.
Exactly. Right. And turn 2, you're sad, and you always make a joke like right on time or whatever. But
you gotta say it.
you're kind of okay with the turn 2 Elf. Had it, always say had it.
Had it. Yeah. That's proper play.
But once you get to turn 3 plus, the Mystic Elf is a pretty bad draw. But because it's so good in your opening hand, it's still worth putting in your deck.
Okay.
Another example is like a card like Frenzied Goblin. If you have like the turn 1 Frenzied Goblin. Yeah, the turn 1 Frenzied Goblin is pretty awesome. Like it just enables.
Insane.
Yeah, it just enables so many attacks, and it just sets your opponents like, when can they stabilize the game? Like it sets that so far off into the future potentially.
But I think that card's pretty decent in a few other ones. Like it's definitely good in winning.
Yeah.
Which again we don't get like big bonus points for it, but like that can shut the door, because if you have it in a winning scenario and your opponent's like, here's my huge blocker, Irrel, right? And you can get by. So I give it, I wouldn't like, I think that a card that I would put in this category over Frenzied Goblin as like a sort of a development all-star is Foundry Street Denizen.
Yeah,
like,
that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, like you turn 1 it and you're just like, all right, I'm going to be hitting you for 2 for the next couple of turns, and maybe one turn I can even get in a big hit, and then anything else, like it stinks. Like it even isn't very good when you're winning, right? Like you draw it off the top, right, and it's like your turn 5, and it's like, well, here, I'll make a 1/1 that might be 2 power. Like it's really one of the most lowest rung spells, non-land cards that you could get.
Right.
It's terrible in Parity, and it's awful when you're behind.
Yeah, I think that's a better example. And there's situations when you're behind and your opponent starts tapping mana, and you're like, oh no, what's it gonna be? And if it's Foundry Street Denizen there, you're like, whew, like that was the best thing it could have been, pretty much.
Dodged a bullet. Yeah. I mean, really, when it comes to spells, like that is about the best case.
Yeah. You're like in that scenario where your opponent has 3 creatures to your 1, and you're just like, oh geez, what is it? Oh, okay. It's that. Yeah, that's a better example. So here's one that I've seen a lot of people saying like, well, Ornithopter, like you can put Ornithopter in your deck to help you convoke. Well, okay, if it's in your opening hand, maybe it's good, but in any other time you draw it in the game, it's just awful. Like if you draw it when you're winning, it exerts no pressure at all. It's even worse than the Foundry Street Denizen. In the stalled board, it's like, maybe it will chump block for me at some point in the future. I don't know. Or if you're losing, I mean, it can chump, but it doesn't really get you back in the game.
Right. It has that same sort of fog effect that doesn't even affect the whole board.
So is Ornithopter good enough in your opening hand that it's worth putting in your deck, even with a bunch of convoke spells? Like, I doubt it, just because it's so bad in every other scenario. It's not just that it's not great in other scenarios. It's that it's like almost a 0 in all the other states.
Yeah, and without getting into we've clearly made our opinion clear on the Ornithopter, but I think the thing that I always think about it is like, I'd rather just have any 1-drop.
Right. Yeah, like a card like Soulmender, right? If you're winning, it's not a great draw. It's like a 3 out of 10, but it's not a 0 out of 10.
No.
Right? If you're in Parity, it's kind of annoying. It's not it's not great. It's maybe, a 3 there as well, but it's better than 0.
Right. I would play a Fugitive Wizard.
Right.
And because it trades for Oresco Swiftclaw, and it trades for Generator Servant, right? Like I can actually do something with it.
Right, yeah. And if you're losing, it might actually block something with 1 toughness. Or it can sit around and maybe gain you a couple life or something before it chump blocks or whatever. But the Ornithopter is just not going to do anything.
Right.
So that's the difference between getting a 3 out of 10 and a 0 out of 10. And it's important, when you have a card. So it needs to be so good in its quadrant, and I don't think it is.
Right.
So here's a card, cards that are specifically good in Parity.
Parity, okay,
So stalled board, neither player is clearly ahead. Rummaging Goblin is a great one because, a Rummaging Goblin, given enough time, will win you the game because it allows you to discard your lands and have spells, and just having more spells than your opponent is usually enough. like maybe Stormtide Leviathan, right? It's like you need to get pretty deep in the game, but also maybe Stormtide, you could say it's good when you're losing, as long as you can stay alive long enough to get to the 8th land. That's can be difficult, and it's definitely not a slam dunk. But if you do, the Stormtide will usually instantly stabilize you. But
yes.
But from a parity state too, not only does it like prevent your opponent from attacking you, it's going to be an unblockable attacker and will kill them very quickly. It's one of the best cards you can draw in a top decking scenario.
Right.
So like another one that's maybe good in parity, aggressive mining. I'm still undecided on it if it's good enough or not. But that's really when you would want to draw it, is like, okay, we're both playing off the top. We both have plenty of lands. Oh, I drew aggressive mining. It's pretty good. But in any other game, it's pretty rough.
Yeah.
Like you're not playing turn 4 aggressive mining. Like you're just not doing
No,
that.
yeah, it's terrible.
You're not playing it in development.
Right.
Like if it's in your opening hand, you're like at best like 7 turns away from ever wanting to cast it. Right?
Yeah, I mean, you've essentially mulliganed.
Right. If you're winning, I mean, maybe it will be like a backup plan, but
no. But I mean, I want to close the door, right?
Right. It doesn't exert pressure,
right,
on its own.
Right.
And if you're losing, it's like, yeah, that's like super sketchy. It's going to take you time and resources. And the thing is, like, even if you claw your way back into the game, all of a sudden you're aggressive mining locked and you can't even proceed to win.
Yeah.
So,
I think people are way too optimistic about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, well, if I'm behind, I can draw aggressive mining and help. No, you need things that affect the board immediately when you're behind. Right. When you're really getting beaten down, you need a Rotfeast or Maggot. You don't need an aggressive mining. No. So the question becomes, is it good enough at parity? God, on paper it is. Like, if I have 7 lands and in my my curve goes up to 5 with like a 6 drop or whatever, like aggressive mining draws me 4 cards by the time I untap. And I can cast anything. It feels like it should be good enough in that spot. But I have never seen it be good. I have never seen this card be good.
I've seen it be close to good, but just not quite work out.
Yeah, and this is, remember, we're blocking out 3 of the 4 quadrants here to focus on this one and saying it should be good, but we haven't really seen it be good, or it got close once, right? So, my gut says that we've had this format for long enough to know and to have learned that this card is not the real deal for limited.
Yeah, I mean, even like a Jace's Ingenuity can help like bridge you towards extra lands, right? It can help, that as your 5-drop can help bridge you into your 6-drop or your 7-drop or something like that. So it's not at 0 in development. You might cast it on turn 5. It might be good, but the aggressive mining on turn 4 is like you can't even do it. Like it's just not. It's like that play does not compute.
Right.
So aggressive mining is actually like a 0 in development, which is rough.
And it's brutal too because you actually can't do that, right? Like you would think you would be like, well, I'll play my aggressive mining. And then later on, I'll start sacking my lands because I clearly don't want to sack lands yet. But it says you can't play lands. Like, you just can't do it. You can't even get the tempo out of the way now. It's not like a down payment scenario. It's like, no.
Okay, so some cards that are specifically good when you're winning. Hammerhand, I think, is a pretty good example where it's like, all right, like I have 3 creatures to your 1 creature. Hammerhand's actually a pretty good draw there. And I've seen it used pretty well to that effect. Now, if you look at it in the other quadrants, in development, you can use it on turn 3 or turn 4, and you get a little more power into play permanently. You get a little more damage in, right off the bat. But if you just look at like the resulting board state that you have after that turn, it's not really that much better than you already had.
Yeah, I still think I like it for development just because of the whole can't block thing. Like, it can set the tone for you to be the beatdown. Yeah. And you can steal, your opponent feels like they've stabilized and you get another hit in with something, or maybe, the haste factor, like maybe you're able to play like a 3 on turn 4, you play a 3 and then put the thing on it and hit them and they can't block. And all of a sudden, like the entire math is different from what they expected it to be. Like, I feel like in development is where that card should shine.
It's decent there, but I mean, do you really want Hammerhand in your opening hand? I guess I feel like I would rather top deck it in a scenario where I'm trying to squeak out the last few damage. But
I want to try to find a way to sequence it into my opening.
Yeah, it's okay in development.
Yeah,
I guess I'm just not crazy about the card in general, but like it's okay there. If you're losing, it's awful. And if you're at parity, if your opponent's life total is low enough, it might do some work for you, but likely it's not very good.
Yeah, I think the average case scenario on parity, by the way, just for people wondering, is, you know, killing one creature may or may not help. Right? We're not trying to set up a precarious board state where it's like, I've got 4 welcome turns and you have a spider. Right. So that's parity. Like it's a little more like there's some stuff on the ground staring at each other. Maybe even one creature's getting in, you know, and you're still at parity. Like it's not like a scenario, you know, you're at 18 and they've got a 1-power flyer that's pecking away at you or something. Or maybe a more likely scenario for M15 as an example is, let's say they have a carrion crow, but you've got a soul mender. Right. Like you're at parity. You're looking for something to break this thing open. Like even if you're slightly behind or, you know, slightly ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. You say like, oh, you know, by the numbers, you know, one player is winning, but you kind of both know one of you is going to draw a relevant card that's going to trump whatever else is happening.
Exactly.
You know, and that, so yeah, like you said, even though the life totals may be changing a bit, it's still.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that we know that the people know that, like, cause I was talking today on social media a little bit about, active treason. Cause it's an example that you and I used, on the original version, of this show. And then also I used it in the column. And, you know, I think people were saying, well, if you're at parity, because I said active treason's not that good if you're at parity. And people were saying, well, if you're at parity, it can be really good because you can like steal their best blocker and kill them. And that does happen sometimes. But like I'm trying to set up like parity is a little bit more stabilized than that.
Right.
Generally.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Anyway. Yeah.
I agree with that. So, you know, like Law of X was the example we gave. Like, you know, Law of X is really only good if you've been ahead for a significant portion of the game, right?
Right. You have to have done quite a bit of work.
Yeah, and clearly, like, the turn 5 Law of X is not that good. Law of X off the top, if your opponent's not at 5, it's not that good. And Law of X, if you're on defense, is like a 0.
Right.
So, I mean, is it worth playing Law of X? Sometimes, I guess. But it's not like a slam dunk card, even though it's, you know, pretty good in one of the quadrants.
Yeah, but here's the cool thing, Brian. I think that the quadrant theory leads you to the conclusion that sometimes it's good, and it'll even lead you to, well, where would that be then? Right. Because then the scenarios where you're like, well, it's good in a deck where I'm winning. Right. Now, we don't mean that you've won, but where you're putting yourself in a winning position. And in this case, that would mean a very aggressive deck, right? Where you're ahead, and now this can shut the door.
Right.
And so now you know, well, I need that type of deck to make this work.
Yeah, so I think, I guess if you want to go to cards that are specifically good when you're losing and not really that good in other scenarios, I think like board sweepers might be the most like common example.
Yes,
right? Like,
for sure.
You know, so I guess in this set it would be a perilous vault, right? You're not cracking perilous vault if you're ahead,
right?
And it's really not too likely that your plan is going to be turn 4 perilous vault, turn 5 sacrifice it. You're right. It's like, I mean, maybe, but if it's not really a card that you're that excited to have in your opening hand.
Right.
I guess if you're at parity, you may be able to like set up some kind of awkward scenario where your opponent's kind of afraid to play out too much stuff or whatever, and you may get some small advantage in a stalled game. And obviously, like it's a huge insurance policy just to have it in play. But it's not like great. It doesn't like break the game wide open if you're at parity. But if you're losing, like assuming you can stay alive long enough to activate it, like that's where it shines.
It's the best.
And that's why you put it in your deck, right? Like it is for that type of scenario. So, like a planar cleansing or that type of card is there. And, if they're cheap enough, those cards are definitely worth putting in your deck. Board sweepers like that, assuming they're cheap enough.
So they can pull their weight.
Exactly.
Even if they're only really good in one quadrant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even though like they're close to zeros in some of the other quadrants, they're just tens potentially in the losing one, and that's worth playing. So I guess I want to talk about like some other ways that I use the quadrants, right? Mm-hmm. And some stuff that I have in the back of my mind. So
I love this part. Actually, this is my favorite part of the whole thing.
Yeah, so like I'm looking for ways to find cards that fill more quadrants than you might expect, right? And a big one for me is cheap creatures that maintain value late in the game. So any creature that comes down on like turn 1, 2, or 3 that is a good top deck on turn 10 is just a great card. I just love those cards, in general. So, Sunblade Elf, right? It's like, it's great on turn 1. It's pretty good on turn 4. It's pretty good on turn 10, right? It's pretty good on turn 15. Like, that's just a way to increase the overall performance of your deck is like,
Right.
is you're just filling more quadrants with your early creatures than they normally would be able to. A card like Typhoid Rats is a pretty relevant draw in any type of game.
Especially, and you got to realize how good that is, right? You're getting a pretty relevant draw out of a 1-mana play that you can make on turn 1 or turn 10.
Right.
That's asking a lot of a Magic card.
Right. And you figure, like, you can't just ignore all creatures that cost 3 or less, right? You'd be taking a huge risk if you did so. But given that you need to put some of these things in your deck, I want to have ones that are going to fill, as many quadrants as possible. So that's where a card like Typhoid Rats comes in. Something like a Johnny's Pridemate could be, it's as good as any 2-drop on turn 2, but potentially on turn 10 you have a Sungrave's Pegasus out or some other way to gain life or a Soul Mender or whatever, and that's a very good top deck there, because you're building towards a way to break through the stalemate. So I'm always looking for cheap creatures that can be used late in the games. Even like a sleeper like Satyr Wayfinder, if you're playing the graveyard deck, might be a good draw on a turn other than 2, assuming you can dump something into your yard that will be useful for you.
Yeah, that's one where it's usually pretty clearly best on 2, but has some hidden upside later. And that's what you look for. This is how you get these small edges,
Yep. The other way I'm using it as like a evaluation tool is, because a lot of times the way we evaluate cards is we call them analogs, cards that are similar. You look at a similar card from the past and see how it performed, and then you say, well, the new card's kind of like that. I'm going to assume it's, kind of going to perform the same way.
Yeah.
So here's an example. So a card from the original Mirrodin block, like Sword of Caldra. It's like a 4-mana equipment, and it costs 4 to equip, so it's 8 mana to get your first equip going, which is a lot. But you get +5/+5.
Oh, wow.
And it has like some ability. It's like any creature dealt damage by it is exiled, or whatever. But it's a huge creature. It doesn't matter, right? So you look at Haunted Plate Mail. Haunted Plate Mail is very similar to that card, right? It's 4 to equip and 4 to cast, and it makes your creature big. But the huge weakness of Sword of Caldra that always bothered me and made me regret playing it was, what about those games where your opponent is just beating you down and you don't have time to get a creature in play, or they keep killing your stuff or whatever? The sword is awful in those games. Those games that you're losing, it's very, very bad. So you say, oh, Haunted Plate Mail is kind of like that. This card must be bad too. But the Haunted Plate Mail has that extra ability where if you don't control any creatures, it can become a creature. And that's very important when you're losing.
That's huge. It just fills this like huge gap in cards like that.
Yeah, so that game where you're losing, you're getting beat down, you can't keep anything in play, all of a sudden your Haunted Plate Mail is not a dead draw. It's actually a decent draw. Because, even if they kill the only creature you have, you can make it a creature and block. It's pretty important. So if I was just going off of analogs, I'd be like, oh, this card's not really something I want to play. But if I'm using quadrants and I realize, oh, this card's not a 0 when I'm losing, it's more like a 6 or something like that, all of a sudden that's very relevant to the overall evaluation. Otherwise, you can be like, oh, invasive species. Maybe it's kind of like Rock Jockey or like some. Look it up if you're really curious. But it's a 3/3 for 3 with kind of an ability that sets you back in your development. It's very annoying to play the turn 3 invasive species and return your land.
Yes, very annoying.
It's kind of a bummer. But the advantage that the invasive species has over a card like Rock Jockey is that invasive species actually has cool advantage in a parity state because you can abuse the another comes into play ability. The number of times I've returned the +2 or the 2/2 draw card, Shaman of Spring. The number of times I've cast invasive species on turn 7 to bounce my Shaman and replay it to gain long-term advantage. Like, you might not think of that, and you might not be like, oh, this is actually a good draw late in the game as well, not just in my opening hand like a card like Rock Jockey.
Right.
So I'm being
and saving your creatures from encrust and all that kind of thing too.
Exactly. So you realize, oh, this card has value in parity, whereas another similar cheap creature might not. Or even like kind of a cutesy one like Crowd's Favor, because you can convoke it without any mana available. It can be really good on defense. And it can get you back in the game where it was like, oh, you were stalled on lands and you didn't get to play your Scrapyard Mongrel until 2 turns later than you really needed it to. But all of a sudden you can convoke and block and kill their charging Rhino or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's huge because it can get you back into a game that you were far behind in, a game that you're losing. And most combat tricks you don't think about that, but because you can cast it for 0 mana, it can. Right, so usually you think of combat tricks, you want to use them on offense, and they're good when you're winning, or they're good in your development potentially. But you can actually use Crowd's Favor when you're losing too, to good effect. The other thing you can do is use it to evaluate cards that are just very weird. So like Return to the Ranks.
That rare.
That rare, right? It's so if you let's apply Quadrant Theory to Return to the Ranks, right?
Okay, yeah. So development.
Is it good in your opening hand? Like.
Hell no.
No, it's actually like very bad.
It's just uncastable. So
you're really unlikely to have anything in the graveyard.
That's a 0. Yeah.
Okay, so like if you're winning, is it good? Does it exert a lot more pressure on your opponent?
No, it is not a door slammer.
Not really. Yeah, it's like, oh, maybe I get back a thing or two, but you might just not get back anything at all. In that case, it's going to be highly inconsistent from a winning position. If you're losing, is it good?
It might be.
It might be, if you're losing,
it's inconsistently good.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. But I don't think it will ever be great.
No, it'll never be great because by definition, you can't get back your great creatures.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of the games that you're losing is because you just came out slower than your opponent. Your opponent developed their board faster than you were able to, and in those games, Return to the Ranks is usually not good. And the games,
so that's bad. I mean, I wouldn't call that a glowing review.
Yeah, so we've been below average in all 3 quadrants so far.
Yeah, sometimes really below and other times below.
So then we figure this card must be very good at parity for us to want it. Now, is it very good in parity?
No. Again, it faces a consistency issue because if both players have dumped their hands on the table and are kind of staring at each other, it's not likely that you have a lot of creatures in your graveyard, your two drops in your graveyard. And even if you do, those aren't the ones that'll usually get you, that'll affect the board in the way that you're looking for vertical, not horizontal here, unless you've got some like mass pump spell or something.
Yeah, you can get to a certain stage in the game where a couple of Runeclaw Bears aren't really going to move the needle that much.
Fairly shrug-worthy.
Right. So if we were, kind of banking on parity quadrant to carry this card, it really didn't. So all of a sudden, you just kind of look at it and be like, I don't really know what this card is for. Like, it doesn't really seem like it's better than average in any of the quadrants. So why would I play it?
But and that's great though, right? I think that's the whole point here is that if you kind of put on your scientist hat, right, and you look at this from just a input data, output result. The result on this card is it's not very good. And it's just like, okay, noted. Not very good. It's not good in any of the quadrants, and it's inconsistent even in the scenarios where I could imagine that it was decent. Like, that's a lot of evidence saying that this card's not very good. And from my experience with it in M15, it bears that out. It's not very good.
Okay, so I have 2 more things for you. One is we can quiz each other on a few cards.
Yeah, I got at least 1 card lined. Actually, I have 2 cards lined up for you.
Okay. You want to do that now?
Yeah, let's do that now. All right.
Okay.
The first one I have is a red card.
Okay.
And it is Act on Impulse.
Act on Impulse.
Yeah, so that's I'll read it real quick just because it's a weird uncommon that doesn't pop up that often. Exile, it's 2 and a red, it's sorcery. Exile the top 3 cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may play cards exiled this way.
Okay, so
run it down for me.
Okay, so on curve, in development.
Put me on the spot, in the hot seat, Brian Wong.
Right. So how good is it on turn 3? Well, the answer is basically uncastable. How good is it on turn 4? Well, I guess probably the best case scenario you can get on turn 4 is you get a land off of it and maybe a 1-drop, although that seems pretty unlikely. So I'm not really thrilled about having that in my opening hand.
This is pretty bad for development.
If I'm winning, if I'm ahead, does it exert a lot of pressure on my opponent? And the answer is inconsistent. So it may or it may not. But really, the best it can do is whatever my mana is minus 3 is the most amount of mana I can spend on threats, which is really a lot less than my opponent. You know, my opponent would be happy with me doing that rather than just casting a 5-drop or something.
Right. And and I think that, like, to bring the focus back to what Quadrant Theory is really all about, which is board state, Act on Impulse does not consistently affect the board state. And that's a big knock when you're trying to slam the door. There are other ways. We talked about Lava Axe. That can slam the door on a game, and it doesn't affect the board state also. So it's not exclusive to that, but that's generally what you want to do, and this doesn't.
Right. If you're losing, I mean, most of the time, if you're far behind, it's not going to allow you to cast enough spells to get back in it. The only scenario where I could see it being good is if you just need a specific removal spell that you can actually cast afterwards. Like, I need a lightning strike to kill your accursed spirit, and this is going to maybe dig me towards that, but maybe not. I'm still not thrilled about it, especially if you consider how bad it is in scenarios where you're just getting steamrolled, which
is again the board state problem.
Right. And then at parity, well, this could be a pretty good draw off the top. You know, if you have 8 lands out already, it's going to be a better than average draw. It's going to be maybe like a 7 out of 10.
Okay, so we've narrowed it down to, well, it doesn't fit in, what you were looking for earlier, Brian, which is, cards that kind of touch on all the quadrants and maybe are even pretty good in all the quadrants. That's a special card. This doesn't fit that description. This is one of those more narrow cards that, there's certain matchups you don't want it in. There's certain decks that you don't want it in. I mean, I've always found it awkwardly placed in red because I don't want parity in red. I want to kill my opponent.
Right.
Pretty quickly and stay ahead of them with cheap burn spells and efficient 2-drops. And Act on Impulse just doesn't really seem to have a lot of a home in that scenario.
Yeah, I'm going to say it kind of fails the quadrant test there because it's just not good enough in the quadrant that it's good in to justify its weakness elsewhere.
Right. I got another one for you.
Oh, I thought it's my turn.
Oh, we're going to go back and forth?
Yeah.
All right, hold on. Let me move over to the hot seat. Okay, I'm in the hot seat.
It's probably only lukewarm here. Here's your card, Illusory Angel.
Oh, good one. All right, so let's break it down. We'll do a similar one that you did. So development.
You want me to read the card first?
Why don't you do that?
2 and a blue for a 4/4 flyer, and you can only cast it if you cast another spell this turn.
Right. So let's look at it from a development perspective. It's actually an interesting one for development because on the face value, it looks pretty bad, right? Like you can't turn 3 it. That's just never going to happen unless you're playing Ornithopter or whatever. So that's not a thing. But you can turn 5 it. And I think that, we kind of defined development roughly as up to your 5th mana or your 5th turn, sort of where you're still playing stuff out from your hand. You can also turn 4 it in some scenarios, so that's not going to happen as often. So I wouldn't give it a super low grade for development, but it's not an all-star in this category either. It's probably like a 4.
Yeah, one of my Grand Prix teammates had the discipline to hold the 2-drop in his hand all the way from turn 2, turn 3, turn 4 to save it for turn 5 to help cast the Illusory Angel. But if you consider that you had to do that, that's kind of unfortunate. You would have rather had that 2-drop in play, but
how much damage could that 2 have done, or whatever?
Yeah, the fact that you had to do that for the Angel is kind of a knock against its development status, right?
Agreed. So yeah, I'd put it like in the 3 to 4 range. It's not an all-star, but it's not. It's a little better than it looks. Winning, hard to say. This one actually probably falls a little short because interestingly, what we've said is, well, any reasonable spell. Right? Like anything that costs more than 2 mana is usually just great. But if we're looking to slam the door on our opponent, spells which we cannot cast are basically the same thing as lands, and those are the worst case scenario. Now, that's not always going to be the case, but when I evaluate stuff like this, I'm going to assume, okay, well, what if I can't cast this there? Like, how bad is that? And it's horrible. So even though I can sometimes, I'm actually not going to give it a very high grade in winning either, even though it would normally fit the bill perfectly of being a creature, like especially an evasive big creature that can help slam the door.
Okay,
I'd put it around the same category as development.
Quick metaphor. Okay. So I was shopping at Safeway, and there was a guy who would always be outside of Safeway, and he'd say real change, and you could give him change or not, right?
That's that newspaper, right?
Yeah, but he didn't have the newspapers. He just wanted money.
Oh, okay.
So he didn't actually have the papers.
He was just mising off of
he would just say real change all the time. And usually I usually use my card and I didn't give him change or whatever. But there was like one day when like I needed quarters or something like that. So I think I used like a vending machine or something like that. And I ended up with like 30 dimes. And I was like, what am I going to do with these dimes? These are like so annoying. So then I gave him the 30 dimes, and I was like, sorry that they're dimes. And he's like, they'll spend. And I was like, if you're him, that makes sense, right? Like, the dimes are inconvenient, but they still get the job done, right?
Yes.
And I think the Illusory Angel is kind of like that in the winning state, where maybe you can't cast it right away, but when you do cast it, like, it'll get the job done. It'll spend. You know what I'm saying?
Door being shut.
Yeah, it may... The 4/4 flyer doesn't necessarily need to happen this turn to close out the game. Frequently, it's good enough later.
Okay.
If you had a big enough lead.
No, that's totally true.
So
it'll spend. I would bump it up maybe one notch for that. So let's look at Parity.
Okay.
And at Parity, it's a really interesting one because, again, it comes down to if we can cast it. If we can cast that spell, it does creep up into the exact type of things that we want. Huge flyers. It's not huge, but it's very big and definitely fits the bill of being a card that could break Parity pretty easily if we can cast it. So if we're under the sort of normal Parity circumstance where we've had a reasonable curve out, but our opponent did too, neither of us was able to get, a really good advantage on the other person, and now we're kind of top decking. If I top deck the Angel, I'm really bummed because now I need another specific mana cost card to get it done. But overall, I would say, yeah, I think it'll spend. Like, I think that this is a pretty good card at Parity. I think you're going to find a spot to cast it if you've got 6 or 7 mana available. And when you do, I think it's going to matter a lot. So I'd give it a pretty good marks for Parity. I think you've got a little bit of time, and I think the power level's there where you want to be for Parity. So I think I like it for Parity.
Yeah, I think in the example where you have maybe 6 or 7 lands out and you're 18 life and your opponent has a Carrion Crow attacking you, I don't think you're really like sweating it out that whether or not you'll be able to cast the Angel before you die, right? You're maybe they have your interest, but you're not concerned, right?
Right. But of course, like when we're talking about real bombs, like let's compare it to a card like Soul of Ravnica in that spot, right?
Sure.
It's obviously bigger, or no, here's a much better comparison. Master of Predicaments.
Right.
So same body. You would much rather have Master, even though you don't have anything in your hand, so you're probably not getting an advantage from that, just because you can simply cast it and start doing work. Mm-hmm. Where with the Angel, there's going to be times where you just never get to. There's going to be times where it takes 3 or 4 turns. There's going to be times where you have to awkwardly cast something that you weren't, like maybe your next card is a Peel from Reality, and you're like, well, I really want to get this Angel on the battlefield, so I'll just set my opponent back some marginal amount just so I can get it down, right? Where if you had drawn Master of Predicaments, played it, and then drawn Peel, you'd probably feel pretty strong. So, it's not as good as something like that, but I think it is decent in that scenario. Losing. Hard to say. I think it just gets lower marks across the entire board. Like, I think that, like, this is a typical card where the power level's there, but the inconsistency is a huge knock against it. And if you're losing and you can't cast it, you're just dead. If you're losing and you do find a way to get it on the battlefield, it's really good. Like a 4/4 flying blocker is about as good as they get. So, yeah, it's just tough to say. I think that, like, you have to start it at a reasonably high grade because of the power level of the card and what it does, and then knock it down a bunch because there's going to be times when you just can't cast it.
Yeah, it has a lot of potential when you're losing, because a lot of times when you're losing, you need to deploy things quickly. So, I mean, obviously, like, sometimes you just can't cast it. But the turn that you do cast it and you also did something else, like, that could potentially, like, be your defense.
That's a game.
And put you ahead all of a sudden. You could be like, I was getting crushed. Now I'm winning.
Yes.
Right.
It is that powerful.
It is a drawback that you have to cast another spell. But on the other hand, you get it for only 3 mana, right? So it's like that actually, it makes it more swingy. But when it works, it really, really works. And sometimes you just need a high variance card to get you back in the game.
Yeah. But again, like, let's compare it to Master of Predicaments. If you're losing, you'd rather just draw that because you can just play it, right? Yeah. So it can't score as highly as those cards. It does get, but it is a little bit potentially like it's interesting because it matches up so well with Master. Like you often cast it on the same turn anyway. It's interesting. So overall, like I think the things that this reveals are that it's pretty good at parity. And it's a little too inconsistent to be super happy with the other ones, but that the power level is there so that you still play it. Like the potential, because if we take off the clause of like, maybe I can't cast it and just assume that you can, it's excellent at all of these spots.
And the thing is, it's not flat out bad in any of the quadrants, even with the drawback.
No, it's not. So good card. Like I think that's a card that you pay attention to and you accept your risk. And when you get there, the card is awesome. All right. Back in the hot seat with you.
Okay.
Dang it, I forgot the name. Is it Sacred Armory?
Okay.
Is that the card?
Yes, that is the card.
That's the one I want.
That is the 2-mana artifact that has 2 mana, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn.
Yes, that's the one. Uncommon.
Okay. So how good is it in development? How good is it in your opening hand? I would say a little bit subpar. You're not going to want to spend the mana early in the game. Creatures usually trade for each other in the early game pretty readily anyways, whether or not you spend mana. So I would say below average in your opening hand.
Okay.
If you're winning...
it's terrible, right? Like,
I wouldn't say terrible. I mean, like, if you're playing an artifact deck, it's nice to get an artifact down. It's not like you got nothing out of your turn 2 play.
I would give it a 1 or a 2 out of 10. It doesn't develop your board. Like you're looking to commit things to the board that matter, and this just doesn't matter. This is a late game play or a late game effect.
Yeah, it's like a 2.5 or something like that.
You are such a nice human being.
Well, it's like you have something relevant in play. It's not like you have nothing, but you don't have anything great.
Okay.
If you're ahead, like you have more creatures than your opponent, etc. This poses them a big problem because not only do they have to block everything, otherwise you can just deal a ton of damage to them. It means any potential blocker that they play in the future will at best trade for your creature. So it really extends the horizon of how far they have to come back in the game. It makes it very difficult.
Yeah, it's quite good when you're ahead.
Yeah, when you're ahead, it's really nasty.
Yeah.
At parity, pretty good.
God, it's really good, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes any creature you have at least a viable attacker. It can at least trade. And if you're playing it in a tokens type strategy, it just means if I have more creatures than you, I'm going to eventually win this game.
Right.
And if you're losing, it's pretty darn bad.
Yeah, it's bad.
It's just like,
yeah.
Do you really have mana to activate this? It's going to be usually an awful top deck if you're losing. So I would say it's flat out bad when you're losing. It's significantly below par in development, but it's quite good in the other two, and I would say overall it makes it worth playing in most decks.
Yeah, I think so too. It's been going up a little bit for me. I've been picking it slightly higher and been fairly happy with it. And I'm not surprised. And breaking it down like this sort of shows me why.
Yeah, I really like it in just either just raw aggressive decks or in token decks. I think it's quite good in both.
Okay.
And your last card, Marshall.
Yes.
Life's Legacy. This is a sorcery for 1 and a green. As an additional cost to cast Life's Legacy, sacrifice a creature. Draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power.
All right. What a good one. So developing. Bzzz. It's really bad.
I mean, what are you going to do? Play Runeclaw Bear on 2, Life's Legacy on 3? Like, I'm not really that thrilled about that.
I'm not thrilled about that play. So I really don't like it for developing. Winning, it's interesting. I think it's pretty bad. And it's funny because you would think that this would be the type of card that you could, like it does something for a relatively cheap effect and you could use it to help slam the door by getting way ahead on cards and overwhelming your opponent. But the problem is the reason that you're winning is usually because your creatures are attacking. And if you sacrifice one of them, you could put a big dent in that.
I think it is. It will, this is a card that like it will probably work. Like if you sacrifice a 4/4 or something like that, it will probably work. But the thing is, you're giving your opponent an out. What if you just draw 4 lands or 3 lands in a Mystic Elf or whatever? Because they needed something very good for them to win that game, and you just gave them another chance for something very good to happen for them.
Yeah.
So I think like it will probably work, but is it really that much better than whatever else you could be doing? And also you're giving your opponent a chance when they needed a Hail Mary.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about board state. It doesn't affect that. And then we're also talking about slamming the door on our opponent, and it doesn't do that. So I think it's just really bad in that scenario, actually. When you're losing, I'll do parity next. Sorry. When you're at parity, I kind of like it here. Like, I certainly like it better than the first two. My reasoning is that a lot of times what you want to try to do is get ahead on cards, right? Like, you can either just cast the most powerful thing you have, or, like we mentioned Jace's Ingenuity earlier, you can peel off of Jace's Ingenuity and just bury your opponent in card advantage. And this could help you do that. The interesting thing about it is that oftentimes the creature that you sacrifice is the thing keeping you at parity, right? Like, you sacrifice your biggest thing or whatever, and now all of a sudden you're not at parity anymore. You're a little behind. And so you need to make that up with the cards that you draw. My gut tells me you probably will be able to do that pretty often. But like, man, it's so much worse than just drawing cards. Just like, again, like, you need to have, in parity, we assume that you do have creatures, but like, there's also scenarios where you just don't have any, right? Like, what you need is creatures, not to kill one of your creatures that you don't have. So that's mediocre, I'd say, at parity. Like, I think it's probably its best spot though. 'Cause losing, it's hard to imagine that this is going to be a great card when you're losing. You just cannot sacrifice board presence when you're losing, even temporarily. Like, it's just too risky.
Yeah. You just figure it's going to take you so long to turn those cards into actual, things in play.
Yeah, board affecting.
Yeah. And when you're already behind, it's just you can't really afford to make that deal.
Wow.
I guess I would say, like, at parity, that's when you have the best chance to be Magical Christmas Land, where you're sacrificing Fido Titan or the creature that was tapped down,
encrusted or something.
Yeah, the creature was encrusted, or you get to pull off the cool combo of like attack. Okay, you block. I Titanic Growth, and then post combat, I do the Life's Legacy. So it's like, okay, like, if you say like there's 3 or 4 really cool ways Life's Legacy might work, it's most likely that you can do them at parity, because in the other scenarios, it's just hard to find the wiggle room. So if it's going to work, it's going to work in parity. It's not really going to work anywhere else.
I think what I've learned here is that card's not very good. And I've played it a couple of times and found it not very good.
Yeah.
And this explains a much better why. It's just not good in any of the scenarios. The only one that it's okay in is parity. And I wanted to say where this card really shines, but it doesn't shine. It's just like merely okay sometimes. And that's its best case.
Right.
Boo, I'm out on this card.
Yeah,
But this helps me frame it mentally. Like, I kind of knew in my head that card sucked and that it wasn't worth like a high pick or anything like that. And I've played it, and I've also not played it index, and now I know why. It's just not very good.
Well, that's real talk.
Yeah. Bring in the reality.
All right, so this is the one thing that I think I missed in the first time we did this talk. So I want to talk about how, like, the different archetypes use the Quadrant Theory in a different way.
Go for it.
So an aggressive deck is going to have more emphasis on development, because you need to come out of the gates quickly with an aggressive deck, right? So you want more cards to hit the development quadrant, and this is the deck most equipped to take advantage of winning quadrant cards, because you're more likely to be ahead of your opponent. Because if the game's gone right, you've curved out. That's what aggressive decks want to do. You're more likely to be able to use that threaten effect, that lava axe, that into the void, whatever, to close the door on your opponent. So if you're the kind of person who likes cards that are specifically good in the winning quadrant, you want to be playing an aggressive deck to take advantage of them. Good. A control deck is a deck that usually wants more parity cards than other decks. In limited, it's pretty hard to get like the Aetherling, or like just the one card that's a win condition that, like, if when I draw this, then I kill you, whatever, because I've stabilized the game. It's hard to find those in limited. So typically what you actually need is to be like, I don't just have that one thing I want. It's just that my cards on average are more powerful than yours, or my cards on average are better top decks in a late game scenario. So you build your deck to have more parity cards, and what you're trying to do by controlling the game is getting the game into that parity state. So it could be cards that are specifically good when you're losing, because you're less worried about, the aggressive pressure, and you're probably going to you're probably going to put no cards that are only good in the winning quadrant in your control deck. I mean, I would frequently try to. I would never put a Lava Axe in a control deck.
Exactly.
I would never put a Threaten in a control deck unless I had a sacrifice outlet or something else to do with it.
You
right?
need another reason, yeah.
Exactly. And I can focus my development cards on cards that are defensive. So a card like Coral Barrier is a very powerful card in development if you aren't that worried about attacking. Right? It's actually like probably the best thing you can do on turn 3 because it provides you 2 blockers. So it kind of shifts the focus on what your development cards are a bit, but you still need them. You still need to deploy things in limited. You can't just wait. It's not like you can consistently Supreme Verdict on turn 4. You need to start playing out blockers. And you can frequently get a little bit bigger bodies, Research Assistant on turn 2, Coral Barrier on turn 3, if you're willing to give up their potential as attackers. So, like, those are the kind of cards you're looking for. But you're looking for cards that are good when you're behind, because you might be behind more often than not. And you're looking for cards that are just good top decks once you manage to stabilize.
Good.
And
I
then,
like that. That's cool.
And then mid-range. Mm-hmm. Mid-range is really the style that I like to play. But it really means you kind of fall somewhere between aggro and control. Which means if you play against aggro, you are the control. If you play against control, you are the aggro. Right, so you have to be willing to shift. And I think mid-range decks, therefore, need the most balanced cards. You need the cards that are the best in the most scenarios, because you don't know. If it turns out you're the control in the matchup, you're playing against the aggro. You're playing against a very fast deck. Well, if you were main decking that Lava Axe, all of a sudden that's a huge problem, right? Or if you're playing against the control deck, you can't necessarily that Aether Spouts might not be that good, for example.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So you need to have your cards be pretty good against either opponent, which means you need to be more focused on like a holistic, 4-quadrant theory, rather than kind of focusing on one, because you don't know what your role is going to be.
Yeah, and you don't want spikes over into different quadrants, right?
Right.
Like you don't want some of your cards, like you want consistency throughout your whole deck, right? Because where you'll start to fail there is if you're consistent, like you go like Runeclaw Bears and a reasonable 3-drop, like say an invasive species or something, and then like a Curd Chieftain or something like that, where you're like, okay, these are all pretty good at all stages, and then you randomly have a Lava Axe, right? That's where it's like, whoop, your deck kind of fails a bit because there's going to be matchups where that card is absolutely terrible.
Right. But you also need to have enough cards that are good at parity that you can kind of go toe to toe with the control deck if you have to. Right. And it kind of feels like, just by having, slightly more expensive creatures or something like that than the aggro decks, you can kind of beat them at the parity game. But you need, stuff. You need Curd Chieftain, or you need something like that. Something that will allow you to have game against the control decks too. But also the powerful development, so you might be able to just come out fast and steal a game against them, because sometimes you're aggro, sometimes you're control. You need to be balanced. But that's where you really need to not have any cards that are too focused on either winning or losing.
Very good.
There.
I like that. That was good. All right, let's do a little recap before we take off here. So, Quadrant Theory. It's a card evaluation tool. It's going to help you get used to the new cards that you're seeing, and also you can apply it to cards that you already know and kind of reverse engineer why maybe you thought a card was good when it came out. You've played the format for a while. You don't really like it anymore for some reason, but you're like, but I think that card's good. What is going on? If you put it through put your friends in the hot seat or put yourself in the hot seat, I think you'll have a better idea after going through Quadrant 3 about maybe why your gut's telling you that card's not as good as you thought it was. And once you start doing that repeatedly, you'll start doing it naturally when new cards come out, when you question cards, when people question cards that you think are good, and you can really start to put some evidence, a little bit of muscle, a little bit of meat behind what you're saying, as opposed to just, it doesn't feel like it's a good card, or I don't think it's a good card. It's like, well, let's take a look at when and where it's good, and then we'll get a better idea of why you think it's good, right? Like maybe you always draft aggressive decks, so you think Lava Axe is the best card in the format, right? Well, let's take a look at the decks that most people draft, not just you, and we'll see why it's probably not the best deck or the best card in the format, that kind of thing.
Right. And I think it will really, especially cards that are specifically good when you're winning or specifically good when you're losing, it will really help shed some light on why those might not be as good as you think they are or better than you think they are.
Yeah, and I think that's really good. Great stuff, Brian. That was a fun episode to do for sure.
Yeah, I was glad to revisit a topic. I know this will hopefully be helpful for people. And if you haven't listened to 184, I would recommend that as well.
Yeah, that's 184 episode. And then also, if you'd like stuff in written form, I did write the column about this too on Daily MTG. So you can find it there. Quadrant 3 everywhere. If you guys want to contact us, you can do so via email, lr@lrcast.com. Also via Twitter, an even better way often to contact us because it's quicker and easier. It's Marshall_LR for me and Brian_LR for Brian. And great place to just ask a quick question or say hi. If you would like to join the clan on Magic Online, you can send me a message on there, Marshall_LR, and I will get you an invite. The only rules, of course, are that you got to love Magic and you can't be a jerk, which incidentally are the same rules that we're going to apply to the subreddit, which I mentioned at length earlier. You can find the link for that on lrcast.com if you're having a hard time finding it for one reason or another. And of course, for all things limited resources, lrcast.com is where you want to go to find it all. It's all there. The blog, the episodes, you can find the 1-for-1, the link for the 1-for-1 there, all that kind of stuff, all on lrcast.com. Guys, thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you next week.
So the other day, I was playing Magic Online, and I got to the finals of my draft, and I got disconnected. It's kind of weird, but it happens. So try to log back on, and it tells me I'm already logged on. But that's normal. That's what it usually does. So close out, reopen the program, log back on, but it doesn't get past the loading screen. So I let it try to load for a minute. Nothing happens. Restart the client. This time it tells me, please be patient while Magic Online is loading.
Oh, no.
Not a tough ask, but I'll give the program the benefit of the doubt. It's giving me an instruction. I'm going to follow it. So I let it sit for approximately 5 minutes. Nothing, not a thing. My patience wearing pretty thin, and I'm dangerously close to timing out of my match. So I close it, restart, relog on, loading again. It's not going to let me back in. So resigned to my fate. I uninstall, reinstall, and the client works again. Bizarre. Anyways, my compensation request is denied because apparently second place is good enough, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that there are many people who can't run the new client at all, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that having the time and money to spend on my hobby is not a luxury that everyone in the world can experience, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that there are people with serious terminal illnesses like ALS and the research to find a cure is woefully underfunded, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that many Americans are having their First Amendment rights violated by the police in Missouri, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that there are 780 million people worldwide that lack access to the most fundamental human right, clean drinking water, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that the laws of thermodynamics necessitate the eventual heat death of the universe, rendering all chemical reactions and life impossible, which is pretty upsetting until I remember that we just got our 47th email espousing the merits of Ornithopter in an M15 draft. Seriously, people, stop. I beg of you.